On October 7th, 2023, one of the most documented atrocities in recent history took place in southern Israel. And to really understand what happened, we need to cut through the noise and look directly at the evidence. So in this explainer, we're going to do just that. We'll walk through the attacks using detailed investigations from the UN, Human Rights Watch, and military analyses to break down what happened, where it happened, and to whom. Okay, let's get into it. To make sense of such a chaotic day, we're going to break things down by location. First, we'll look at the big picture, the military operation itself. Then we'll zoom in on three very different places: a music festival, a residential community, and a military base. And finally, we'll see how international investigators classified everything they found. So first things first, the events of October 7th weren't just a random raid, no. Sources like the UN and Human Rights Watch all agree this was a highly planned, highly coordinated military assault that Hamas called Operation Al-Aqsa Flood. And the beginning of that assault was just a stunning display of coordination. I mean, look at this timeline. In just an hour and a half, you have thousands of rockets firing, the border fence being breached in multiple spots, attackers flying in on paragliders, and an attack coming from the sea. This wasn't chaos. According to investigators, this points to some serious planning and communication. Now, before we dig into the specific battlegrounds, it's really important to just grasp the human scale of this. In total, 1,195 people were killed in the attacks, and the vast majority of them, 815, were civilians. On top of that, another 251 people, from little kids to grandparents, were taken hostage back into Gaza. It's the staggering scale of violence that really defines everything we're about to look at up close. All right, our first deep dive is the Supernova Music Festival. This was supposed to be a huge party for thousands of young people out in an open field, but it became one of the main and one of the most brutal targets of the attack. And the attack on the festival wasn't just some quick hit-and-run thing. For more than 5 hours, militants pretty much owned that area. They were systematically hunting people down, shooting at them as they tried to get away in their cars, as they ran for their lives across open fields, and as they desperately tried to find any place to hide. A survivor's testimony to the UN really paints a horrifying picture of what it was like to be hunted like that. They said it was like shooting ducks. Perpetrators were driving bikes and golf carts over the field and just shot them. That image, it just captures the absolute helplessness of being trapped out in the open, chased by attackers who could move so much faster. The UN Commission of Inquiry also documented this just brutally consistent pattern that was used on people hiding in roadside bomb shelters. First, militants would surround the shelter. Then they'd toss grenades inside. If you weren't killed by the blast, you were shot as you ran out. If you stayed inside, you were shot there. It was like a playbook, and they repeated it over and over. For the people who were trapped inside those shelters, hiding for hours, a lot of them under the bodies of their friends or complete strangers, the psychological terror was just unimaginable. One survivor told the UN, "We prayed to die. Nobody wanted to remain alive in that place. We just wanted it to end quickly." Okay, so from the open fields of the festival, the violence also flooded into these small residential communities. And the attack on Kibbutz Kfar Aza shows us a different, but just as methodical kind of assault. This time, it was targeting families inside their own homes. I mean, just look at the imbalance of forces here. For the first couple of hours, the entire defense of this community rested on the shoulders of its 14 volunteer security members. They were up against hundreds of heavily armed militants, and that included elite units from Hamas's al-Nukba forces. The odds were just impossible. And to make a horrific situation even worse, an Israeli military investigation found a whole series of critical failures. The volunteer defenders couldn't even get to their weapons right away because the armory was locked, which was standard IDF procedure. A real military force didn't show up until almost 1 in the afternoon, hours after it all started. And when they did arrive, there was just chaos and confusion. In some truly tragic cases, soldiers would check on a family, tell them, "Stay in your safe room," and then leave, only for militants to come in and attack that same family just moments later. Inside the kibbutz itself, the violence was incredibly up close and personal. We're talking about entire families being murdered inside their houses. Both Human Rights Watch and the UN documented this consistent tactic. Attackers would either shoot right through the safe room doors, which weren't bulletproof, or they just set the entire house on fire to force the terrified family out into the open. So, our third location shifts from civilian communities to a military target, the Nahal Oz outpost. But, as the UN investigation found, this was no ordinary military base, and the fight here was anything but equal.
Yeah, the soldiers at Nahal Oz were not combat troops. They were mostly young women, surveillance observers whose job was to sit and monitor the border on screens. They were unarmed, they were in a command center and shelters on the base, and they were just completely overrun.
The methods used here were just horrific. The IDF's own investigation said grenades used in the command center released some kind of toxic gas that caused suffocation. The UN concluded that many soldiers were killed while hors de combat. That's a legal term that basically means they were already out of the fight. They were unarmed, wounded, or had surrendered. They weren't a threat anymore. This includes a verified video showing a wounded female soldier being executed. And on top of all that, the UN found clear patterns of sexual and gender-based violence against the female soldiers at this outpost.
To build their case for gender-based violence, investigators rely on really direct, factual descriptions of what they see in the evidence. So, for example, the UN report describes a verified video of a captured soldier with this very clinical language. This kind of careful, non-speculative observation is how they build their conclusions, piece by piece.
So in this final section, we're going to see how all of these documented events at the festival, at the kibbutz, at the military base, how they all add up in legal terms. After digging through thousands of pieces of evidence, what did the major investigators actually conclude? Well, the legal consensus is pretty clear. Both the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and Human Rights Watch concluded that the actions on October 7th amounted to a long list of war crimes and crimes against humanity. We're talking about the intentional killing of civilians, hostage-taking, torture, widespread sexual violence, and the deliberate destruction of civilian homes. However, there is a very different narrative out there. In a statement from January 2024, Hamas's political bureau claimed that its fighters did not target civilians. They argued that because of all the chaos, many Israelis were actually killed by their own security forces by mistake. But the UN's own investigators issued a direct rebuttal to that. After looking at body cam footage from the attackers themselves, plus CCTV, dash cams, and hundreds of witness accounts, the commission said that claim is contradicted by an overwhelming amount of evidence.
And that brings us to our final thought here. The October 7th attacks were documented in real time by everyone involved. The perpetrators, the victims, security cameras. It created this massive, horrifying archive of evidence. The findings of multiple independent investigations are pretty extensive and they largely line up. And yet, there is still this profound battle over the basic facts of what happened. Which leaves us with a question. In the face of so much documentation, why does this struggle over memory and truth still persist?